The autumn twilight painted the sky in shades of amber and gold, but Veronica Sterling saw none of it as her Mercedes tore through the evening traffic, 3 hours late to pick up her daughter. She'd promised Isabel 30 minutes, just one quick meeting with the investors from Tokyo. The meeting that stretched into presentations, negotiations, contracts worth millions. 8-year-olds understood these things, didn't they? But when her car screeched into the park's empty lot, what Veronica saw through the dimming light made every maternal instinct explode at once. There, on a weathered wooden bench beneath the glow of an old street lamp, sat her daughter, head tilted peacefully against the shoulder of a complete stranger, a man she'd never seen before, his worn jacket, his calloused hands resting carefully near her small frame, a little girl beside him watching with eyes far too knowing for her age. Veronica's designer heels hit the pavement like gunfire as she ran, her mind screaming one word: danger. She was about to destroy this man. She was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. The man looked up as Veronica approached, his expression neither alarmed nor guilty, just tired, patient, the kind of tired that came from working 2 shifts and still showing up for the third. He held up one hand, palm open, a gesture that said, "Wait, please," without speaking. The little girl beside him, maybe 7, with braids tied with mismatched ribbons, tugged his sleeve and whispered something Veronica couldn't hear. He nodded, then gently, so gently it made Veronica's throat tighten. He shifted his shoulder so Isabel's head wouldn't roll when he moved away. Her daughter stirred but didn't wake, her face streaked with dried tears that caught the lamplight like tiny rivers. "Before you say anything," the man said, his voice low and steady, "your daughter's been sitting here alone for over 2 hours. She was crying, hard. I couldn't just walk past." He stood slowly, careful not to disturb Isabel, and Veronica saw him fully then, mid-30s, worn jeans, work boots with paint stains, a face that had seen weather and worry but held no malice. His daughter stepped closer to him, her small hand finding his automatically, protectively. "My name's Oliver. This is Rosie. We were reading on the next bench when your little girl started crying. I asked if she was okay. She said her mom was coming. That was at 5:30. Veronica's phone buzzed in her pocket, probably her assistant with the contract revisions. She ignored it. The weight of Oliver's words hit her harder than any boardroom confrontation ever had. 5:30. It was past 8 now. She looked at Isabel, really looked at her, and saw what she'd been too busy to notice for months: the way her daughter's shoulders had started to curve inward, the way her smile had become something she put on like a coat before school, the way she'd stopped asking Veronica to read bedtime stories because she knew the answer would be, "Maybe tomorrow, sweetheart." Tomorrow never came. It was always another meeting, another deal, another reason why being a CEO mattered more than being a mother. "I'm sorry," Veronica whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was apologizing to Oliver or to the sleeping child who'd found comfort in a stranger's kindness rather than her own mother's presence. She moved closer, her hands shaking as she reached for Isabel. Oliver stepped back, giving her space. But his daughter Rosie didn't move. She stared up at Veronica with dark, knowing eyes that seemed far older than her years. "She was really sad," Rosie said softly. She kept saying her mommy promised. She kept looking at that path. The little girl pointed to the park entrance where Veronica had just come from. "Every time someone walked by, she thought it was you." The words cut deeper than Veronica expected. She lifted Isabel into her arms. When had her daughter gotten so light? And felt the child's arms automatically wrap around her neck. Still asleep, still seeking the safety that should have been there hours ago. Isabel's breath was warm against her collarbone, and Veronica noticed the tear stains on her daughter's favorite yellow dress, the one she'd insisted on wearing this morning because Mommy said we'd get ice cream after. Another broken promise. Another lie dressed up as good intentions. Veronica looked at Oliver, this stranger who'd shown her daughter more care in 2 hours than she'd managed in 2 weeks, and felt something crack inside her chest. "Thank you," she managed, her voice breaking. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Oliver's expression softened, though something sad flickered in his eyes' recognition. Maybe, of a parent drowning in circumstances they couldn't control. "She's a sweet kid," he said quietly. "She told Rosie all about her school play next week. Said she was playing a tree." He paused, and Veronica felt the unspoken question hanging in the air like smoke. Would she be there? Would she find another excuse? Another meeting that couldn't wait? Another reason why the empire she'd built mattered more than watching her daughter stand on stage in a construction paper costume? Veronica carried Isabel to the car, the child's weight somehow both too light and impossibly heavy. As she buckled her daughter into the back seat, Isabel's eyes fluttered open, confused and puffy from crying. "Mommy?" Her voice was small, uncertain, as if she couldn't quite believe Veronica had actually come. "I'm here, baby," Veronica whispered, smoothing back Isabel's hair. "I'm so sorry I'm late." But Isabel just nodded. That terrible, understanding nod that said she'd expected nothing different, and closed her eyes again. That nod broke something in Veronica that all the corporate battles and hostile takeovers never had. It was acceptance, resignation, the look of a child who'd already learned not to hope too hard. The drive home was silent except for the hum of expensive German engineering and the sound of Veronica's carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. She glanced in the rearview mirror every few seconds, watching Isabel sleep in the back seat, and tried to remember the last time she'd actually tucked her daughter into bed. Last week? Last month? The penthouse felt cold when they arrived, all marble and glass and designer furniture that looked beautiful in magazines but offered no comfort. The nanny met them at the door, her expression carefully neutral as Veronica carried Isabel past her, up the floating staircase to the bedroom that looked like it had been decorated by someone who'd read about childhood in a catalog but never actually lived it. Veronica sat on the edge of Isabel's bed long after her daughter had fallen back into deeper sleep, watching the rise and fall of small shoulders, counting breaths like they were shares in a company she'd forgotten she'd invested in. Her phone buzzed incessantly, emails about the Tokyo deal, messages from her assistant, a reminder about tomorrow's board meeting. She turned it off. For the first time in 15 years, Veronica Sterling turned off her phone. The silence that followed was deafening. In it, she could hear all the moments she'd missed, all the times she'd chosen a conference call over a conversation, all the nights she'd come home to a sleeping child instead of one who'd waited up hoping for a goodnight kiss. That night, she dreamed of weathered wooden benches and calloused hands, and a little girl with mismatched ribbons who'd shown her daughter more kindness in 2 hours than Veronica had managed in 2 months. She woke up at 3 a.m. with her heart racing. Not from the usual anxiety about quarterly reports or stock prices, but from a deeper, more primal fear, the fear that she'd already lost her daughter, that the distance between them had grown so wide that no amount of expensive gifts or belated apologies could bridge it, the fear that Isabel would grow up and leave and never look back, and Veronica would be left in her glass tower wondering when exactly she'd traded her child's love for a corner office and a 7-figure salary. The next morning, Veronica did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She called in sick. Her assistant sounded genuinely concerned, as if the concept of Veronica Sterling taking a day off was a sign of the apocalypse. "Reschedule everything," Veronica said, looking at Isabel across the breakfast table where the child sat quietly, pushing cereal around her bowl, still withdrawn, still hurt. "Everything," she repeated when her assistant started to protest about the board meeting. She hung up before there could be further argument. Isabel looked up, suspicious and hopeful in equal measure. "You're staying home?" The question was careful, guarded, the tone of someone who'd been disappointed too many times to trust easily. "I'm staying home," Veronica confirmed, and watched something flicker across her daughter's face, surprise, then joy, then the swift shuttering of expression as if Isabel was afraid to believe it might be real. They spent the morning doing things Veronica couldn't remember doing since Isabel was very small, making pancakes that burned on the bottom, building a fort out of couch cushions, reading picture books that Isabel was probably too old for but still loved. And slowly, so slowly, Veronica felt the wall between them begin to crack. Not crumble that would take time, but crack, letting small slivers of light through. Isabel laughed at one point, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere deep and genuine, and Veronica realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd heard that sound. But one day wasn't enough to undo months of absence. By the afternoon, reality crept back in the form of urgent texts from her CFO about a crisis with their biggest client. Veronica's fingers hovered over her phone, torn between two worlds that felt increasingly incompatible. Isabel watched her from across the living room fort, something dimming in her eyes as she recognized the familiar pattern. "You have to go to work," she said flatly, not a question, and started gathering up the books they'd been reading. The resignation in that small voice, the way her daughter was already protecting herself from disappointment, it hit Veronica like a physical blow. She put the phone down. Face down, away from her. "No," Veronica said, and meant it, and watched Isabel's head snap up in shock. "Not today. Today I'm here. The crisis could wait. The client could wait. For 8 years, her daughter had been waiting, and Veronica was done making her wait. They went to the park that afternoon, not the same one where Oliver had found Isabel, but a different one, closer to home, that Veronica had driven past 1,000 times without stopping. It had a playground and a duck pond and families everywhere, laughing and living and being present in a way that made Veronica's chest ache with envy and regret. She pushed Isabel on the swings until her arms got tired, and it felt like penance and redemption wrapped into one. The following weeks tested Veronica's resolve. The board questioned her sudden unavailability for evening meetings. Her assistant created increasingly elaborate scheduling systems to protect what Veronica started calling Isabel time. Colleagues whispered about whether she was losing her edge, whether motherhood had made her soft. Veronica heard the whispers and didn't care, which surprised her most of all. She'd spent 15 years proving she could compete in a male-dominated industry, building an empire from a startup in her garage to a company worth billions. She'd worn her workaholism like armor, her absence from her daughter's life justified by the success she was modeling, the financial security she was providing. But what good was security if Isabel grew up without a mother? What good was an empire if she was too alone to enjoy it? 3 weeks after the incident at the park, Veronica took Isabel shopping for groceries, something she'd never done before, always leaving it to the household staff. The supermarket was overwhelming, bright and loud and full of choices she'd never had to make. Isabel guided her through the aisles with the confidence of a child who'd accompanied the nanny dozens of times, pointing out which cereal she liked, which apples were best, where to find her favorite juice boxes. And there, in the produce section, reaching for organic carrots with a little girl in pigtails beside him, was Oliver. Rosie saw them first, her face lighting up with recognition. "Isabel," she called out, and suddenly the two girls were hugging like long-lost sisters, chattering excitedly about nothing and everything. Oliver straightened, a slight smile crossing his tired face when he saw them. "Miss Sterling," he said politely, and Veronica felt absurdly formal, being called that in her jeans and old sweater, the first time in weeks she'd left the house without a designer suit. "It's Veronica," she said, surprising herself. "Please." They stood there awkwardly for a moment while the girls talked. Two parents from completely different worlds, united by the strange intimacy of that night in the park. Veronica found herself studying him again, the worn edges of his jacket, the calluses she'd noticed before, the way Rosie stayed close to his side, not out of fear but comfort, the way he listened when his daughter spoke, really listened, as if her words about school and friends and the butterfly she'd seen that morning mattered more than anything else in the world. "I never properly thanked you," Veronica said finally, "for that night, for staying with her, for—" She stopped, not sure how to articulate what his kindness had meant, how it had been the catalyst that cracked open her carefully ordered life. Oliver shook his head. Anyone would have done the same. But Veronica knew that wasn't true. She'd spent years in a world where everyone wanted something, where kindness was a currency traded for favors and advancement. Oliver had wanted nothing except to make sure a crying child wasn't alone. The simplicity of that act, the the purity of it, made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. "Mommy," Isabel tugged at her sleeve. "Can Rosie come over to play sometime?" The question was tentative, as if Isabel expected to be told no. Their house was too busy, too important for playdates. Veronica looked down at her daughter's hopeful face, then at Rosie's equally excited expression, then at Oliver, who was already forming a polite excuse. "This weekend," Veronica heard herself say. "Saturday afternoon, if that works for you both." She watched Oliver's surprise, saw him glance at her mansion address shopping bags and expensive leather purse and hesitate. She understood that hesitation, the weight of class difference, the assumption that people like her didn't really want people like him in their pristine homes. "Please," she added softly. "Isabel would love it. And I'd like to talk, if you have time." Saturday arrived with the kind of nervous energy Veronica usually reserved for merger negotiations. She'd dismissed the staff for the afternoon, wanting the house to feel less like a museum and more like a home, though she wasn't sure she'd succeeded. When Oliver and Rosie arrived, she saw their wide-eyed reaction to the marble foyer, the sweeping staircase, the art on the walls that cost more than most people's houses. But Isabel barely gave them time to gawk, grabbing Rosie's hand and pulling her toward the playroom, their laughter echoing through spaces that were usually silent. Oliver stood in the entryway looking uncomfortable, his work-worn hands shoved in his pockets, and Veronica felt a sudden wave of shame at the ostentation surrounding them. "I know it's a lot," she said apologetically, leading him to the kitchen, the one room in the house that actually felt lived in since she'd started cooking with Isabel. "Coffee?" Oliver nodded, settling onto one of the bar stools that probably cost more than his monthly rent. The silence between them was awkward at first, filled with the distant sounds of the girls playing upstairs, but gradually they fell into conversation. He told her about his work carpentry during the day, online engineering courses at night, the dream of eventually starting his own sustainable furniture company. About Rosie's mother, lost to a drunk driver 3 years ago, the grief that still ambushed him at unexpected moments, the way he'd had to learn everything from scratch, braiding hair, packing lunches, being both mother and father to a little girl who'd already lost too much. Veronica found herself sharing things she never shared: the divorce when Isabel was 2, her ex-husband's ultimatum that she choose between him and her company, the choice that seemed obvious at the time but haunted her now, the way she'd convinced herself that success was the best legacy she could give her daughter, proof that women could build empires and shatter glass ceilings, the slow realization that she'd built an empire but lost her child in the process. "I thought I was modeling strength," she said quietly, staring into her coffee cup, teaching her that women don't have to choose between ambition and family. But all I taught her was that ambition matters more than she does. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she felt Oliver's hand cover hers briefly, a gesture of comfort that somehow didn't feel intrusive. "You're here now," Oliver said simply. "That's what matters. Kids are resilient. They forgive faster than we think possible." But his eyes held a sadness that suggested he was thinking of his own daughter, of the parent she'd never forgive because she'd never have the chance. They sat there for a long moment, two people who'd taken such different paths to parenthood, united by the terrifying responsibility of raising tiny humans who depended on them for everything. Veronica felt something shift inside her, not a solution, but maybe the beginning of understanding. That success wasn't measured in quarterly earnings or market share. That legacy wasn't about buildings with your name on them, but the memories you created with the people who loved you. The girls thundered downstairs eventually, begging for snacks, and Veronica watched as they sat at the counter sharing apple slices and giggling over inside jokes that had formed in the space of an afternoon. Isabel was animated in a way Veronica rarely saw, her whole face alive with joy, and Rosie was right there with her. The two of them finishing each other's sentences like they'd been friends for years instead of hours. Oliver caught her watching them, a small smile on his face. "They're good for each other," he said. Veronica nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Her daughter had found something here, not in the expensive playroom or the designer toys, but in the simple gift of a friend who saw her for who she was, not what her mother's money could buy. When they left, Isabel hugged Rosie goodbye with a fierceness that made Veronica's chest ache. "Can we do this again?" her daughter asked, and there was vulnerability in the question, a fear that this happiness might be temporary. "Yes," Veronica promised, and meant it with every fiber of her being. She walked Oliver and Rosie to the door, and on impulse, she asked, "What are you doing Tuesday evening? Isabel has her school play. She's playing a tree." She laughed a little. "I know it's silly, but I'd love to come," Oliver interrupted gently. "We both would. Right, Rosie?" His daughter nodded enthusiastically, already planning what to wear. Veronica felt tears prick her eyes again. When had she become such a crier? At this simple kindness from virtual strangers who owed her nothing. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm. Veronica restructured her entire work life, something her board of directors initially resisted until she made it clear this wasn't a negotiation. She hired a co-CEO to handle day-to-day operations, freeing herself to focus on strategy and vision work she could do from home, on her own schedule, during hours that didn't conflict with school pickups and bedtime stories. Some colleagues warned she was committing career suicide, stepping back when she should be consolidating power. But as she sat at Isabel's school play on Tuesday evening, watching her daughter stand perfectly still in a tree costume made of construction paper and dreams, with Oliver and Rosie cheering beside her, Veronica couldn't find it in herself to care about their opinions. After the play, they all went for ice cream, the ice cream Veronica had promised weeks ago and forgotten in the chaos of that Tokyo deal. Isabel's joy at this simple outing, at having her mother there, present and undistracted, was so pure it made Veronica want to weep. They sat in a booth at a diner that Veronica would never have chosen before, with its cracked vinyl seats and fluorescent lights, and she realized she was happier than she'd been in years. Isabel and Rosie shared a sundae, their heads bent together over the whipped cream, while Oliver told a story about Rosie's first attempt at making breakfast that had them all laughing until their sides hurt. This, Veronica thought, this is what I've been missing. Not just time with Isabel, but the simple, ordinary magic of being fully present in a moment. But life had a way of testing resolve. A month later, Veronica's biggest client threatened to leave unless she personally oversaw their expansion project. A 6-month commitment that would require weekly trips to San Francisco and constant availability. The old Veronica would have said yes without hesitation, would have figured out how to make it work, would have convinced herself that providing for Isabel meant sometimes sacrificing presence. The new Veronica looked at the contract, looked at Isabel's upcoming soccer schedule pinned to the refrigerator, looked at the calendar marked with school events and playdates with Rosie, and said no. The client left. Her CFO had a minor panic attack. The board called an emergency meeting to discuss her commitment to the company. Veronica weathered the storm with a calmness that surprised even herself. She let the client go. She weathered the board's disapproval. She took the hit to quarterly earnings and explained to anxious investors that sometimes growth meant stepping back, not constantly pushing forward. Some understood. Many didn't. But Isabel understood, and that was all that mattered. Her daughter came home from school one day and found Veronica in the kitchen making snacks, available and present and there, and threw her arms around her waist with such force it nearly knocked them both over. "I love you, Mommy," Isabel whispered into her shirt, and Veronica felt those 3 words heal something she hadn't realized was broken. Oliver became a steady presence in their lives, not intrusive, but there when needed, a friendship built on mutual respect and shared understanding of parenthood's challenges. He taught Veronica how to fix things around the house instead of immediately calling expensive repair services. He listened when she vented about board politics and offered perspectives that her business school-trained colleagues never would. His presence was comfortable in a way Veronica hadn't experienced since her divorce. No agenda, no expectations, just 2 people who enjoyed each other's company while their daughters became inseparable. Rosie spent weekends at their house. Isabel went to Oliver's modest apartment and came home talking about how they'd built a birdhouse together, her hands sticky with wood glue and her eyes shining with accomplishment. 3 months after that first playdate, Veronica made a decision that sent shockwaves through the business world. She stepped down as CEO entirely, taking on a consulting role that let her work 20 hours a week from anywhere. The press had a field day. Think pieces appeared about whether women could really have it all, whether she'd given up too much, whether this was a victory or a defeat for feminism. Veronica ignored all of it. She was too busy coaching Isabel's soccer team, too busy learning to braid hair for school dances, too busy being present for every small moment that collectively made up a childhood. She was too busy rediscovering her daughter, learning who Isabel actually was when given space to be herself, instead of competing for attention with corporate crises. The financial hit was substantial. Veronica's net worth dropped significantly without the CEO's salary and stock options. They downsized from the mansion to a smaller house in a neighborhood with sidewalks and kids riding bikes, a place that felt more like a home and less like a showpiece. Isabel adjusted with surprising ease, thrilled to be closer to Rosie, happy to have a bedroom that felt cozy instead of cavernous. They learned to cook real meals together. Not just pancakes, but actual dinners with vegetables and recipes that sometimes failed spectacularly. They planted a garden in the backyard, just a small patch of tomatoes and herbs, and Veronica discovered a satisfaction in nurturing life from seeds that she'd never found in growing a business. Oliver was there through the transition, a steady anchor when Veronica doubted herself in the small hours of the morning. Sometimes they'd sit on her new, smaller porch after the girls were asleep, drinking coffee and talking about everything and nothing. He never judged her for the life she'd left behind or the mistakes she'd made. He simply listened, shared his own struggles, and reminded her that parenting was a marathon, not a sprint, that every day was a new chance to get it right. Their friendship deepened into something neither of them had been looking for, but both needed a partnership built not on romance or passion, but on mutual respect and the shared experience of trying to raise good humans in a complicated world. One evening, 6 months after that fateful night in the park, Isabel asked the question Veronica had been dreading. They were washing dishes together, a routine they'd developed, and out of nowhere Isabel said, "Mommy, why doesn't Oliver have a wife?" Veronica's hands stilled in the soapy water. "His wife died, honey, a few years ago. It was very sad." Isabel nodded solemnly, processing this information with the seriousness of a child who understood that death was permanent. Then, more quietly, "Do you think he's lonely, like you are sometimes?" The perceptiveness of the question stole Veronica's breath. She'd tried so hard to hide her loneliness from Isabel, but children saw everything. "Maybe sometimes," she admitted carefully, "but he has Rosie, and us, and that helps." The question planted a seed in Veronica's mind that she tried not to water but that grew anyway. She found herself noticing things about Oliver she'd been deliberately not noticing: the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the gentleness of his hands when he helped Isabel with a difficult project, the quiet strength in the way he navigated the world. She noticed the way Isabel lit up when his truck pulled into the driveway, the way Rosie had started calling her Miss V with affection, the way the four of them fit together in a way that felt natural and right. But she was terrified to examine those feelings too closely, afraid of ruining the friendship that had become essential to both her and Isabel's healing. It was Oliver who brought it up first, surprisingly. They were watching the girls play in the backyard, running through a sprinkler on a hot summer day, when he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." Veronica's heart lurched, certain he was about to say he was moving away or that their friendship was becoming inappropriate. Instead, he said, "I'm falling for you. I have been for months, and I know that complicates everything, and if you don't feel the same way, we can pretend I never said anything. But I can't keep spending time with you and not be honest about it." He didn't look at her, keeping his eyes on the girls, giving her space to react without the pressure of his gaze. Veronica sat there for a long moment, watching Isabel and Rosie chase each other in circles, their laughter bright and pure in the summer air. She thought about the woman she'd been 8 months ago, the CEO who'd been too busy to pick up her daughter, who'd measured success in profit margins and market dominance. She thought about the woman. She was now smaller in the world's eyes, perhaps, but somehow larger in the ways that mattered. She thought about Oliver's patience, his kindness, the way he'd shown her what true strength looked like. "I'm falling for you too," she said finally, and felt something settle in her chest, like a piece of herself she'd lost clicking back into place. "And it terrifies me, because what if I mess it up? What if I fall back into old patterns? What if we'll figure it out?" Oliver interrupted gently, finally looking at her with those steady, patient eyes. "Together, one day at a time. No pressure, no expectations except honesty." They sat there, hands tentatively finding each other, while their daughters played, oblivious to the shift happening on the porch. Veronica felt tears on her cheeks, happy tears this time, the kind that came from hope rather than regret. She'd spent so many years building walls, proving she didn't need anyone, that she could do everything alone. The idea of leaning on someone, of letting someone see her vulnerabilities and staying anyway, was revolutionary and terrifying and exactly what she needed. They took it slow, cautious of the girls' feelings and the fragility of what they were building. Dinners together became a weekly tradition, alternating between houses. They told Isabel and Rosie together that they were dating, prepared for questions or resistance. Instead, Rosie looked at Isabel and said matter-of-factly, "I told you so. I knew they liked each other." The girls giggled conspiratorially, clearly having discussed this possibility at length without the adults knowing. Their acceptance, their joy at the idea of their little family expanding, made the transition easier than Veronica had dared hope. Suddenly, she wasn't just parenting Isabel, she was learning from Oliver how to parent with joy instead of obligation, with presence instead of guilt. A year after that night in the park, Veronica Sterling stood in a small art gallery showcasing Rosie and Isabel's school art show. Both girls had paintings on the wall, Isabel's a colorful family portrait showing 4 people holding hands, Rosie's a sunset over a park bench. Oliver stood beside her, his hand warm in hers, while the girls dragged them from piece to piece, excitedly explaining every brushstroke. Veronica thought about the woman who'd screeched into that parking lot, terrified and furious and so lost. That woman felt like a stranger now. She'd lost an empire but gained a life. She'd given up power but found peace. She'd stepped down from her pedestal and discovered that the view from ground level, surrounded by people who loved her for who she was, rather than what she'd achieved, was infinitely better. The business press eventually lost interest in her story. There were new CEOs to profile, new empires to chronicle. Veronica didn't mind. She'd found her success in different metrics now, in Isabel's straight A's and genuine smile, in the way her daughter talked to her about everything from school drama to existential questions about the universe, in the quiet moments of reading together before bed. She measured success in Saturday morning pancakes with Rosie and Oliver, in the garden that was actually producing edible vegetables now, in the community of neighbors she'd gotten to know by name. She measured it in the fact that when Isabel came home from school, she knew her mother would be there, present and available, and happy to see her. Not everyone understood her choices. Some former colleagues acted like she'd had a breakdown, as if choosing family over fortune was a sign of weakness rather than strength. A few friends from her old life drifted away, unable to relate to her new priorities. But Oliver understood. Rosie understood. Most importantly, Isabel understood. Her daughter flourished in ways Veronica had never imagined possible when given consistent love and attention. The quiet, withdrawn child who'd cried alone in a park had transformed into a confident, joyful girl who knew her worth wasn't tied to achievements or possessions but simply to being loved for who she was. That transformation was worth more than any business deal Veronica had ever closed. There were still hard days. Days when Veronica missed the adrenaline of high-stakes negotiations, when she questioned whether she'd given up too much. Days when Oliver struggled with the memory of his late wife, when grief ambushed him and he had to remind himself it was okay to move forward. Days when the girls fought, or when money was tighter than Veronica was used to, or when the complications of blending their lives felt overwhelming. But they worked through it together, with patience and communication and the understanding that perfection wasn't the goal, presence was. Being there, showing up, choosing each other and the girls every day. That was what mattered. On Isabel's 9th birthday, Veronica threw a party in their backyard, nothing like the elaborate, catered affairs she used to organize. Just a homemade cake, some balloons, and Isabel's closest friends, including Rosie, at the center of it all. As she watched her daughter blow out candles, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her, Veronica felt Oliver's arm around her shoulders and leaned into his strength. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure what exactly she was thanking him for finding Isabel that night, for his patience, for showing her what really mattered, for loving her despite her past mistakes. Maybe for all of it. Oliver just pressed a kiss to her temple and said, "Thank you for letting me in." The Tokyo investors eventually came back, by the way. They'd launched their product with another firm, and it had flopped spectacularly. They wanted Veronica's expertise, her vision, were willing to pay premium consulting rates for a few hours of her time per week. The old Veronica would have felt vindicated, would have jumped at the chance to prove she was still relevant. The new Veronica looked at their offer, looked at Isabel's soccer schedule and the camping trip she'd promised Oliver and the girls, and negotiated terms that worked for her life, rather than restructuring her life around work. She took the contract on her terms: limited hours, no travel, complete control over her schedule. They agreed because they needed her. She agreed because it was interesting work that challenged her intellectually without consuming her soul. That's what balance actually looked like, Veronica learned. Not some mythical perfect division of time and energy, but constant negotiation and adjustment, saying yes to what mattered and no to what didn't, being willing to disappoint people sometimes in order to show up for the people who mattered most. It meant missing some business opportunities but never missing another school play. It meant a smaller bank account but a fuller heart. It meant trading her reputation as a ruthless CEO for a reputation as a present mother, and discovering that the latter mattered far more than the former ever had. Success, she realized, wasn't about how much you accumulated, but about how much love you gave and received in the brief, precious time you had on Earth. 2 years after that autumn evening in the park, Veronica sat on a different bench, this one at the playground near their house, watching Isabel push Rosie on the swings while Oliver refereed a pickup soccer game with neighborhood kids. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of amber and gold, and this time, Veronica saw every bit of it. She noticed the way the light caught in Isabel's hair, the sound of her daughter's unbridled laughter, the ease with which Oliver moved through the world of children and play. She thought about that terrified woman who'd run across a parking lot certain she was about to confront a predator, and she wanted to hug that woman, tell her it would all be okay, that the man with calloused hands and a worn jacket would save not just her daughter but her too. The path from that night to this moment hadn't been straight or easy. It had required sacrifice and humility, and the willingness to admit she'd been wrong about almost everything. It had meant rebuilding her identity from the ground up, learning who Veronica Sterling was when she wasn't defined by her career. It had meant vulnerability and trust, and letting people see her at her worst and choosing to stay anyway. But sitting there in the golden light, watching the family she'd built not through biology or marriage certificates but through choice and commitment, and showing up every single day, Veronica knew it had been worth it. Every difficult choice, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt had led her here, to this bench, to this life, to this love. Isabel ran over, breathless and sweaty from playing, and threw herself into Veronica's lap with the casual affection of a child who knew she'd be caught, who knew her mother would be there. "Did you see me on the monkey bars, Mommy? I made it all the way across!" Her eyes shone with pride and joy and the secure knowledge that her accomplishments mattered because her mother had witnessed them. "I saw," Veronica said, hugging her daughter close, breathing in the scent of sunshine and grass and childhood. "You were amazing. I'm so proud of you." And she was not because Isabel had done something impressive, but because her daughter knew, truly knew, that her mother would be there to see it. That was the real victory. That was the success that mattered. As the sun set and they walked home together, Oliver's hand in hers, Isabel and Rosie running ahead, chattering about everything and nothing, Veronica felt a peace she'd never known in any boardroom or corner office. She'd lost her empire and found her kingdom. She'd given up her throne and discovered her home. She'd learned that the biggest mistake of her life, being too busy to be there, had led to the greatest gift, learning what truly being there meant. And in the end, that made all the difference. Not the money or the power or the prestige, but the simple, profound gift of presence, of choosing love over ambition, of measuring success not by what you built in the world, but by what you nurtured in your home and your heart.